All right, real talk. Whether I'm gearing up for a tough workout or preparing for an episode of The Cameron Brown Show, I need to be locked in. And that's where A-Bomb Energy comes in play. This stuff isn't just another energy drink. It was actually created by an Army Special Ops combat medic who wanted something better, something that actually helps you think clearer, focus longer, and retain information, not just give you a quick caffeine spike. And I can tell you, it really works. I've been drinking A-Bomb before I hit the gym, and it's like flipping a switch. My focus is on point, my energy is steady, and I don't get that crash afterward. Same when I'm recording this podcast. I need to be sharp, engaged, and A-Bomb helps me stay in the zone. Plus, it actually tastes great. So if you're looking for something that gives you a real mental and physical edge, go check them out at abombenergy.com. And when you order, just type Cameron in the notes so they know that I sent you. Trust me, you're going to feel the difference.
John, last episode we covered a lot, almost 2 hours worth of this particular topic. And I think to start off, it'd be good to give people a little bit of a recap of what we discussed last episode. And then for the remainder of this episode, we'll dive deeper into the Eurasia side of this podcast.
Sure.
Awesome. So I'll let you kick things off, and let's dive into, once again, a little bit of a recap of what was discussed during episode 1.
If I look to the side, it's looking at my notes because I'm going to try to race through this as quickly as possible for your viewers. First of all, the questions I get mostly is, would Vladimir Putin have invaded or not invaded Ukraine under President Trump because he so respected Trump that he wouldn't have wanted to make difficulties for Trump? Well, first of all, he already did it. He did invade during Trump. I mean, he started invading Crimea and the eastern portions of Ukraine in 2014 under Obama, and President Obama did not sufficiently react. So, like all Russian rulers in the past and all aggressors in history, first they probe, they see whether someone is pushing back, and if they don't push back, they consolidate their salami tactics gains and then push again. First, they pretended that they were Russian separatists in Crimea and eastern Ukraine under President Obama and used little green men whom they said were not Russian soldiers. Then under Trump, Putin started giving these guys medals because they were in fact Russian army soldiers and consolidated their gains. And then they launched a full-scale invasion under President Biden. And now they are, since we successfully aided the Ukrainians in defending themselves, which they've done an admirable job of doing, but we did not give Ukraine the kinds of weapons with enough speed and range and in quantity to shock President Putin into pulling back. And that was President Biden's fault. It was a repeat of the same mistake we made in the 1960s when we pursued a gradualist strategy against the North Vietnamese. And now President Trump wants to pull out of Ukraine and stop aiding. He is negotiating directly with Putin over the heads of the Europeans and the Ukrainians. So it's like Trump and Putin are on the train. The Ukrainians aren't even invited, and President Zelensky is chasing along the train trying to get on it for fear that an arrangement is going to be made at his expense and at Ukraine's expense, with him conspicuously not invited to that negotiating table. As far as President Trump's attempt to solve the peace on day one, he did make a call to President Putin's office in Moscow, but his phone call was rebuffed. Putin had his people issue a statement that he would not engage in any negotiations unless there were no preconditions, although he had some preconditions of his own, specifically that we had to say that we would not sponsor Ukraine's membership in NATO, that we would stop giving them hope that we would do so, that the Russians would not have to give back any of the territory that they've invaded, including eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and that further weapons aids and would be stopped, and that all of the sanctions that we've levied against the Russians would be lifted. So Putin would, gain from this invasion in all sorts of ways. We would effectively be ratifying his conquest. And as for the respect, I don't know how much respect is involved when immediately after he made this phone call to Putin's office, Russian state television, which Putin wholly controls, had all sorts of pictures of Melania Trump naked on Russian state television, which, in the East is quite, well, in any country is an egregious insult to someone. I don't think that Mr. Putin is overawed by Donald Trump, nor is he anxious for an agreement or any kind of treaty. We are, and we, as a preface to these negotiations, which Marco Rubio is, as Secretary of State, is supposed to be engaging in Saudi Arabia, we've made all these concessions about refusing NATO membership to Ukraine, trailing off further weapons supplies, and ratifying Putin's conquests of a fifth of Ukraine at least. Putin is very specific that he doesn't want Ukraine to exist at all. And because it's not because NATO threatens him physically. Under the Conventional Forces of Europe Treaty, we're not allowed to bring our divisions and weapon systems up close to Russia's borders anyway, nor is he's not supposed to bring his army up close to NATO membership. He's been violating those provisions of the Convention Forces of Europe Treaty. We have not. And he also is a signatory to the 1994 Budapest Accord, which guaranteed Ukraine's political independence and territorial integrity and sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine surrendering of its nuclear weapons to Russia and to the United States under an agreement that Russia would get billions of dollars, so would Ukraine, in exchange for those weapons. And Russia would promise not to violate Ukraine's territorial or sovereign or political territory if Ukraine surrendered its weapons. Ukraine kept its part of this deal. We gave Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. Putin stole those dollars, along with appointed billionaires and oligarchs. So if anyone is in violation of their international obligations, it's Putin and Russia, not the United States or NATO. And what he most fears about NATO is not the threat that NATO poses to Russia because of its military capabilities. We could have invaded Russia in the 90s when the Russian army was on its back. We could still invade because Ukraine has been such a sponge of all of Russia's military capabilities that Putin isn't able to move his army any place around the Russian periphery, anywhere. He's not able to defend Siberia against a Chinese invasion, which is a major concern. He's not able to defend the North European plain from the European peninsula to northern Russia, which is just one corridor that everyone from Napoleon to the Germans have used to invade Russia. We haven't invaded there. And the Russians in their bones know that we would never invade. He is mostly concerned with Article 5 moving east, not NATO's weapon systems, because NATO protects his critics. In fact, Navalny and a bunch of Putin's other critics have set up shop in the Baltic states, to the north of Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and in Ukraine and in Moldova and Poland, where they are able to criticize Putin, his corruption, etc., and do so through the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and other press organs. He can't shoot them or jail them or invade those countries to suppress such criticism, because these countries are protected by NATO's Article 5. That's the real reason he dislikes NATO, not because it could invade Russia, but because his critics are protected under Article 5. And to the extent that NATO is a political alliance of democracies, and Putin considers democracy to be a direct ideological and personal threat to his power. That's the real reason he's invading Ukraine, why he will, once Ukraine is conquered, he will go into Moldova, because Moldova is not a member of NATO. He will go into Georgia on the Black Sea, and he will, if he gets away with those, he will start subverting and pressuring the Baltic states, which are members of NATO. And it will all be depending on how we react. As far as the not 1 inch argument, that is a myth, and Putin knows it's a myth. The phrase comes from James Baker's conversation with Shevardnadze, Gorbachev's foreign minister, when he said, well, Gorbachev and the rest of the European NATO members were very wary of a German reunification because of Germany's doing 2 wars in the 20th century. And so Baker said, well, maybe if we let Germany become unified within NATO, we won't move our troops 1 inch, east of where they are now. Baker went back to the White House and reported on his talks with Shevardnadze, with President Bush, the father. Bush, the father, said, Baker, wait a minute, you're getting too over ahead of your skis. That would mean half of Germany in NATO and half of it out, and the other half undefended. That doesn't make any sense. Even Gorbachev agreed. He says, no, we want Germany on a tight leash. That means it all has to be in NATO. And the Germans said so. The chief of staff of the German army, which was very big then because of the fear of the Russian invasion during the Cold War, said, no, NATO's part of the security culture. We need you here to stabilize things and calm the Europeans, that we're not going to get into our old mode of running amok all over Europe. In the final act of settlement signed in 1991, the only provisions that Gorbachev was able to get in exchange for allowing Germany to be reunified, Russia got billions of dollars. The one thing we did promise is that we would not deploy any nuclear weapons in Eastern Germany. But the act of settlement did not constrain NATO in any way from deploying nuclear weapons anywhere else in Europe, including east of the Berlin Wall, nor did it constrain NATO from moving east as far as it could go. When the blowback from the Russian elite started, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, for domestic political purposes, said, oh, the Americans promised not to move NATO east, when they know for a fact that in the act of settlement, it was explicit that NATO could move east. When both men said this, and our State Department diplomats went to Primakov, who was a successor Russian foreign minister, he knows this is untrue, doesn't he? And Primakov said, yes, he knows it's true. I've told him it's not true, but he says it anyway. When Clinton's presidential papers started to come open in 1997, and later Putin and Peskov and others said, oh, we don't want those papers open up, because they knew that these talks and the minutes of these meetings and the treaty and the act of settlement would reveal this truth. This act of settlement, which permits NATO to move east, is binding, because Germany surrendered to the Allies, specifically Britain, France, the United States, Soviet Union, and then later its sovereign successor, Russia, as the conquering powers. So the big four had a legal right to decide whether Germany was reunified, what NATO did with that power. And it explicitly allowed NATO to move east. The Russian dictatorship opposes Article 5, moving east, to protect its political critics. That does not necessarily mean that the Russian people are terrified of NATO. They know that the NATO is a defensive alliance, not an offensive one. And with 30 countries, 31 countries more being members of NATO, the only thing we can agree on is that we won't allow ourselves to be invaded. It is not an offensive alliance. In fact, the only time NATO has ever invoked Article 5 was for America in 9/11. And the only other time NATO has used military force was in Yugoslavia in the Bosnian Serb Muslim civil wars. Russia actually participated with us in the use of NATO's military force to put a stop to the slaughter between the Bosnian Serbs and the Muslims in Croatia and Slovenia and whatnot. Where they did get upset about NATO using its power was when we intervened in Kosovo to protect the Kosovars from being massacred and ethnically cleansed by the Serbs. But this was before Kosovo was an independent sovereign state from Serbia. And we did it on the basis of the UN's duty to protect, as outlined by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who said that it was not sufficient that sovereign countries stop other countries from invading them, but they had an obligation, morally and legally, to stop people from within their sovereign borders from being massacred, like the Germans did with the Nazis and the Serbs were doing to the Kosovars. So we did intervene because the Kosovars were a province inside a Serbian territory, and the duty to protect implied either intervention in the internal affairs of a sovereign country or regime change. That did alarm the Russians and the Chinese. It was indeed a violation of the Westphalian principles that Europe and the United States and the whole world has lived by since the 1600s, which basically said that just because you don't like the regime or its ideology or its religion, you can't invade it to change that regime or their religion. We didn't do that to change a religion, but we did invade to stop a religious war and the massacres associated with it. And when that was followed up by the intervening in Libya to stop the Gaddafi regime from massacring the people in the eastern half of Libya in Benghazi, Gaddafi was, sodomized with a broomstick and murdered, beaten to death. That alarmed Putin, especially after there were popular rebellions in Russia against his rule by the Russian people, which he could not believe he had provoked or that the Russian people did on their own. He believed absolutely that the CIA had organized it. That meant people who were making speeches to the Russian people approving their demonstrations retreated to NATO countries and were protected under Article 5. That not only conflated NATO with his political opposition, but he rhetorically conflated his fate with the Russian people, saying that if he were scared of critics protected by NATO, then so are the Russian people, which is not true. When NATO gave Russia hundreds of billions of dollars to bridge the transition from the communist system to a free market system, but we did not occupy Russia the way we occupied Germany, that meant that we had to give the money to the same people who ran Russia into the ground in the first place. Putin and his buddies stole that money. It'd be like doing the Marshall Plan in Europe while the Nazis were still in power, and of course they stole the money. We didn't steal the money. Putin and his buddies stole the money, and he's still got 100 billion of it as an old bank account, his shell bank accounts. The idea that NATO plundered Russia and used shock therapy to destroy it and plans to is just nonsense. He stole the money. He profited from the aid that the West provided. And if he's scared of NATO's protecting his critics, well, that's his problem, not ours. I mean, we wouldn't allow the Nazis to spend the Marshall Plan money. We didn't find a way that we could get Putin and his Russian mafia and oligarchs. We tried to cut them out, being the middleman between our money and the Russian people, but they intercepted the money, hijacked the process, and impoverished the Russian people. And the Russian people are rightly angry at Bill Clinton for giving lectures to starving mothers and their children about playing by the rules of capitalism, when it was not in any way their fault, but their own elite stole the money that was meant to feed them. So the Russian people are angry at that whole process because Gorbachev was right. It was too much shock and not enough therapy. But that's on Putin. He stole the money, not us.
I got a quick question, real quick.
Sure.
You might have a little bit more as a recap on everything we discussed in the first episode. There's obviously a lot there, and there's a lot going on in current events as well. One thing that came to mind, though, when we think about Zelensky and the narrative that is coming out of both Ukraine and Russia, what I've heard a lot of is if we give up any portion of Ukraine in these negotiations, that inevitably and ultimately Russia, Putin, will end up going after all of Europe. If we allow him in this far, he will keep going. He will not stop in going into Europe. You and I we both know this, that it's not to his strategic benefit to attack any NATO country. Now, might he attack others that have not joined NATO yet, potentially to try to reclaim the Soviet Union? But when you hear Zelensky or somebody say, regardless, he is going to invade and keep going into Europe, what do you think of that when that information is shared in that way?
Well, when we gave Hitler the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, he promised, and we believed him that wrongly, that he would not invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, and he did. We made the same article. Western Europe was defended by the Locarno Treaty. Eastern Europe was protected by an alliance with the French.
Right. So I'm not saying he's going to keep his word. I'm just more so thinking
that's the point. So
along
he's
the
going
lines
to
of
probe is if we let him get away with this, Munich proves that people like Putin, no matter what they say and no matter what we think about this far and no farther, he's going to go farther. And he's going to start with Moldova and Georgia and non-NATO. And depending on how vigorously we resist, he will go after the most vulnerable NATO states, starting with the Baltics. And then if he gets away with that, he'll move. And it's not like it's making Russia powerful.
Yeah.
Russia's power is a hollow shell. Putin and Russia have become China's stocking horse because the Chinese know that a strong NATO and a democratic Russia and like a democratic Ukraine will become a very powerful alliance against Chinese conquest of Eurasia.
Right.
They don't want that. And they like the fact that Putin is opposing NATO. They like the fact that Putin is accusing the Jewish Zelensky, president of Ukraine, of being a Nazi when he obviously isn't. Putin, to undermine NATO, is subsidizing political parties in Europe, in NATO countries, that are indeed Nazis and fascists. The same people who liked invading Russia, who thought Hitler was a great guy. So the idea that he fears NATO as an instrument of Nazism is ridiculous. He's subsidizing the Nazis in Europe and the fascists. We're not subsidizing the Nazis and the AfD in Germany and whatnot. He is. So, yes, he will keep pushing. He's not going to keep his word. And Russia has been playing this game for 400 years. Every year they have increased their territory the size of Belgium. And every time anyone said, oh, they promised this far and no farther, because the Russians, the dictators believe that to look unassailable domestically, they have to conquer externally. But it's a mirage. Russia is not inherently powerful. Ukraine's borders are no more easily defendable than Russia's, but Ukraine has defended its borders much better than anyone expected because it's able to summon the energy of a democratic society. Putin is not able to do that because he turns his Russian people into whipped dogs. And every time the Russian state has tried to ask its people for its energy, the people have said, why should I help you when you take from me with both hands, torture my children, and send my sons into meat grinder wars? Yeah. So as Kennan said, every time the Russian regimes have tried that, they've ended up pitiable, messes. And the only time Russia has changed its internal domestic political arrangements is when they've lost a war, and that lost war has so devastated the prestige of the regime that it's overthrown and reforms come. Just like Alexander I did a lot of reforms in Russia when Napoleon beat him, And then when the Crimean War happened in the 1850s, he freed the serfs. When they lost the Russian Imperial Army and Navy lost the war against Japan in 1905, the Tsar granted the Russian people a constitution. When they lost the war against the German army in World War I, the Tsarist regime was overthrown. And when they lost the Cold War, they tried democracy, but the Communist Party and the intelligence services, of which Putin was a part, hijacked that process. Russia's power is a hollow shell. Russia has taken all that it can from strongmen's ambitions. Its population is shrinking. He's already killed 800,000 of his young people. Any other Russians that can are fleeing the country. He has mortgaged Russia's economic sovereignty to China. Russian industry, except for the defense industry, is hollowed out. Senator McCain was right. It's a nuclear country that's a gas station. And even its nuclear weapon systems are unreliable, because all Russian systems are reliable. And even back in the 1990s, the Russians under Nelson were so alarmed by Chinese intrusions into Central Asia, its territorial claims against Russia and other countries, that they had a big summit in Kazakhstan called This Far and No Farther, under the sponsorship of the Chinese created Shanghai Cooperation Organization called the SCO. And Yeltsin was seated right next to Jiang Zemin, the Chinese president at the time. And Kazakhstan had agreed to surrender 57% of the territory the Chinese demanded. The Chinese did not call it a permanent treaty. They insisted that it was only a truce with barbarians, and that territorial concession would have to be renegotiated in 10 years. Yeltsin asked for help in a very weird way. He was seated right next to Jiang Zemin. He asked the United States to pay attention to what the Chinese were doing. So he said, well, we need to warn the world, and especially the Americans, that Russia is still a great power with an awesome strategic nuclear rocket force, and that we will destroy anyone who tries to violate our territory. Now, why was Yeltsin talking about this? We weren't part of this conference, and we weren't demanding any territory. We never have. No, he was trying to get our attention and say the Chinese are running amok here, taking our territory and the successor states of the former Soviet Union's territory. Help us out here. Instead of saying what we should have said, yes, of course we respect Russia's territorial integrity and political independence, and we respect the independence and territorial integrity of all the former Soviet Union states, and we will be with Russia if anyone tries to violate them. No, we didn't say that. Sandy Berger, Clinton's national security advisor, said, oh, Yeltsin was probably drunk. The Russians had a heart attack. Andrei Kozyrev, who was Yeltsin's foreign minister at the time, lost his job after that because they knew his pro-Western orientation had been shattered by the Clinton-Sandy Berger response. The Chinese had a good dark laugh over that one. All this points out is that the Ukraine war is not just about NATO. And it's not even just about democracy and defending it and defending Putin's critics under Article 5. It is about Eurasia, and it is about Russia being China's stalking horse, because Putin wants to write himself into history books as being the conqueror of Ukraine and reconstituting the Russian Empire, which Russia did not lose. Russia's loss of the empire after the Soviet Union fell that's not what made Russia weak. The empire collapsed under the Soviet and Russian regimes because Russia was weak. Losing the empire did not make Russia weak. Russia lost the empire because Russia was weak. Conquering Ukraine after the West sells it out, using China's money, does not make Russia strong. It makes Russia a stalking horse of the Chinese. And when Russia bleeds itself white, conquering its neighboring countries instead of turning them into allies, the Chinese will seize Siberia, or they'll buy it. That's my nightmare. will wake up some morning and find out the Chinese have transferred trillions of dollars in foreign exchange reserves to the Russian central bank, which of course will be controlled by Putin's oligarchs. And the Russian state will turn into a rump of itself. It will just become old Muscovy. And China's sovereignty will move thousands of miles west to the Ural Mountains. And, then China will become the largest, contiguous country in the world. It will flank India, the former Soviet Union states of Central Asia. It will conquer the Caspian Basin, and it will give Europe a collective heart attack because it will bring Chinese sovereignty and the People's Liberation Army as close to Europe as Genghis Khan was in 1247 or 1227 AD, I think, when thankfully Genghis Khan died. The momentum was still there. His grandson sacked Baghdad in 1258 AD. So, the Chinese plan to, they plan to do this again. In fact, not a classmate, an alumni of my school at Fenn School, Robin Moore, who wrote the book, The Green Berets, wrote the Green Berets song, was an expert on Asia, expert on Vietnam. He gave us a speech back in the 70s telling us that China planned to do this. If you look up Robin Moore and the Green Berets, everything the Chinese are doing now, he predicted. Dr. Michael Pillsbury, who has done a lot of very good translation of Chinese documents and wrote the book, The 100-Year Marathon, which is about when China plans to do a breakout in 2049, basically sending its envoys to every country in the world saying, we've got you checkmated, be our vassals and we won't attack you. That's the deal. And this invasion of Ukraine with China's money is part of that strategy. Putin thinks that he can manage his relationship with China better than Xi Jinping. I'm not so sure. Well, one of their summits 10, 15 years ago, while Putin was standing right next to him, Xi Jinping said, of course, Vladivostok belongs to China. And Putin's head whirled to the left because the Chinese president was saying, we own part of Siberia, right in front of Putin. If you connect that with the fact that the Chinese only recognize borders for a 10-year space, then you get the idea that the war in Ukraine is a much bigger battle than people understand. And as far as people concerned about depleting our own weapons stores by sharing them with Ukraine, I can assure you that once a war starts with China, the weapons that we've given Ukraine in 2 years would be depleted in the first week. Wars are not won and lost by weapon stores. They're won and lost by attrition. And America has always won its wars by letting its allies take the first blow, watching how the new wars are fought, building up, helping these countries by being the arsenal of democracy, which we've done in every war for the 20th century, rebuilding our defense industrial base to prepare for the war and outproduce our enemies the way we've always done. And thank God for the Ukraine war, because the constraints and the bottlenecks and the shortages of weapons, our weapon supplies to Ukraine have exposed the serious deficiencies in our weapons production and our capacity to wage a general war with China. We had better get more than a little frantic about reviving our defense industrial base and using industrial policy to restore the execution skills that are constraining even our chip and advanced defense manufacturing in many of our weapons programs, because we've offshored all of our execution skills to China. We've got to bring all that back, and we're going to have to pay for it, not by borrowing. We'll have to borrow like hell when we fight the war with China, but we have to improve our financial position. We're going to have to pay for a mobilization like we did in the 1980s under President Reagan. We're going to have to raise our taxes, and everyone, my crowd is going to have to start paying their fair share of taxes to pay for defending the nation. and the world from Chinese conquest.
Gotta love the sound of raising our taxes, John.
Yeah, no one likes to pay more taxes.
We'll tune in for a separate episode on taxes altogether.
Well-
We'll leave that for another
Well, I'm
episode.
sure Ukrainians would rather pay higher taxes than look at their flattened cities, you know.
I'm sure.
Um,
I'm sure they would.
in fact, all taxes in all states become states because they have to raise money to pay for wars. That's how great powers stay great powers. You get what you pay for. I'm sure the Chinese, when it comes to, I mean, the military is so dependent on Chinese manufactured goods now, that we are in some ways a great power living on Chinese indulgence. You know, they're sending us even boots. The boots I wore in the army still work, and they were made here. The boots that soldiers wear now, I think they're Herman's boots. They last for about a year of heavy use and they fall apart, and they're made in China. I'm confident that when we order things to fight with China, their deliveries will be late.
Probably so.
So the whole question of the Ukrainian war, it has to be considered in the context of Eurasia, which is an integrated theater. It is not separate. It is not a bunch of separate theaters of East Asia, Central Asia, Europe. They are connected because the North European plain and the plain across Siberia doesn't just separate these theaters, it connects them. Because the Germans have invaded twice from the West, and the Chinese and the Mongols have invaded from the East. Russia's army has not been able to cope with Ukraine. Who believes that the Russian army can cope with a Chinese invasion when the entire population of Ukraine, of Asian Russia, is only 43 million, and the entire population of Russian citizens living across the Amur River in Siberia is only about 6 million people, and the Chinese investors and illegal aliens in Russia already outnumber them. And the three provinces that in China that border Siberia all have about 93 million people in them. So all they have to do is hold hands and cross the border in their own Siberia. That's why the Chinese may give the Russians an offer they can't refuse by saying, sell it to us or we'll conquer it, given the fact that Russia's population is imploding. It doesn't have the money, the technology, or the demography to develop Siberia, let alone defend it. And Putin is alienating the only power grouping, namely NATO and the United States, that's capable of helping him defend Siberia and Russia's territorial integrity and political independence. So, yes, I want Putin to lose his prestige by losing a war to Ukraine. I want the Russian people to overthrow him and become a democracy. I want Russia to join NATO and defend Russia from Chinese diktats on what people can say or not say about China and its aggression. And NATO and Russia become part of one big alliance that protects the rest of Eurasia from Chinese aggression. And NATO has already proved its worth to Ukrainians. If we successfully defend Ukraine and Russia joins it, Chinese ambitions to conquer Eurasia and the largest landmass in the world will be scotched. And as George Kennan, the founder of the Strategy of Containment, said, if America has one strategic priority, it's never to allow any one continental power to dominate the Eurasian landmass and all of its resources and its people and its avenues for conquest. Well, that is only possible if we defeat Putin, get Russia to become a democracy, join NATO, and extend NATO to all of Eurasia and create a similar East Asia treaty organization in Asia, starting with Japan, South Korea, and other Asian allies of the United States to hem
So,
the Chinese in.
yeah, in your opinion, how do you get Russia or Putin to negotiate or to behave in these situations?
He's
Uh,
got no reason to behave. We've already told him that he can have everything he wants. All he has to do is sit back and let us keep offering concessions. He's not begging. You haven't heard him saying, I want to negotiate a settlement. You haven't heard him say that once. We are talking to about a truce or a treaty.
and I know you don't like the
We're the
sound of
only
that,
one.
but
We're
what
negotiating with ourselves.
if that's what you hear externally, right? I mean, that's what we hear. But at the end of the day, you have to. I mean, I hate to say you have to give an inch, but
We have given an inch. We've given him everything he's wanted. Have you heard him say once that he wants a negotiation? Or did you hear him say no? Not
I
unless you
actually,
give me
frankly, I have not
everything I
watched many video
want. And
clips
here's a picture
of
of Melania naked.
yeah, I have not watched much of him talking as of late. It's been a lot of Zelensky and Trump and the U.S. side of things.
You should listen to what Putin says, which is a big no.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't like him, but I listen to him.
So how do you negotiate with Russian diplomats?
You don't. The only way you know you're getting with them, because Russian diplomats have very little wiggle room. When their rulers tell them this is the line you're going to take, they just repeat that line. I can't tell you how many Western diplomats, naives, said, "Oh well, if I give this brilliant argument, my opposite numbers from the Russian foreign ministry will be so impressed by my brilliance and my willingness to negotiate that they will come to have a great peace settlement." That never happens. The only way you know when you're getting anywhere with Russian diplomats is when you say something that they didn't expect, that their ruler did not brief them on, and then they say, "Oh, I'll have to get back to you on that." When they say, "I'll have to get back to you on that," that's when you've made some headway. You've said something that they didn't expect. And the only time that the Russians have ever agreed to do anything that we've wanted to is when their regime is overthrown or in mortal peril of being overthrown. That's the only time in centuries of history that the Russians have ever modified their policies with the world.
Yeah.
And I see no reason to believe that they're going to change. Why would they? Especially now when we're the ones begging for an agreement. He's saying, "I don't want an agreement. I won't even talk to you unless you concede everything in advance," which we've done. And he still hasn't said. He has said something else. He said, the Europeans and Zelensky and the Ukrainians can't be at the table. And it's basically terms of surrender. He's put too much effort and money and lives into destroying Ukraine. He doesn't want a deal to leave Ukraine intact. He wants to destroy it. And with Trump saying, let Putin do whatever the hell they want, even with NATO countries, but certainly with Ukraine, and J.D. Vance saying that he doesn't want to have one more dime in weapons going to Ukraine, why would Putin have any incentive to make any concessions to
But
do
don't
any
you think
deal
that's
at all?
don't you think it's a bit so once again, this might sound terrible in my presentation. I need to present this properly. Don't you think it's a bit like helping him to save face so that he actually is willing to get out of the war? Because
That's a
if
very American thing to say.
okay,
If
right,
he's worried about
hold
face,
on. That's why I said that though, right? I'm trying to present this properly. But
yeah,
if let's just say Trump were to come out and say Russia's awful, Putin is the worst person in the entire world, and we want to continue this war with them, that would be an egregious way to continue the war. So, not saying he's great, not saying he's amazing, I'm not saying he should say that, but I'm saying, don't you think Trump's kind of trying to just give him a way to save face while they negotiate and get this war ended?
no, I think Trump has a man crush on Putin. The last person who said that the rulers of Russia were an evil empire, that they would lie and steal was Ronald Reagan. And they not only negotiated with them, they got rid of the old apparatchiks that ran the communist regime in Russia, but they gave us Gorbachev.
What
In
good
fact,
do
they
you? But what?
explicitly said that we would not have made Gorbachev the leader of Russia had Ronald Reagan not put our backs to the wall. The Russians are big boys. They do not worry about their feelings. And given the fact
He's
we're worried
emotional.
about
Putin's
saving,
very emotional. He's very sensitive.
yeah, he's so sensitive. He's putting pictures of Trump's wife naked on TV, and he's worried about people's face.
This is how I view politicians at all levels. They're all very sensitive individuals.
Yeah, but some are more vicious than others.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain politicians that we may think are sleazes and won't keep their word, but they won't kill you. The Russians, they'll kill you.
They'll kill you. Yeah.
So worrying about their feelings is really, I think, silly.
I'm not.
He's not worried about our feelings.
I'm not saying we're worried about their. I'm more so saying is like, do you think that's the play right now? Is like basically he's presenting this information in a way to help Putin save face so that they can come to a reasonable agreement. But then I saw the other day, or I guess it was yesterday, was it that Zelensky decided not to proceed with the deal, or they decided not to proceed with the deal because they didn't like the mineral and resources portion of the agreement that America was going after. What was going?
That was so egregious. Trump saying,
for the record, I don't actually
know.
know anything about it. I saw the headline.
Trump said, we're not going to give you anything unless you let us plunder your resources. I mean, it's that was just so awful. I mean,
it's like 4 hours before they were supposed to agree to it.
Yeah, and Zelensky did not refuse to go to the negotiations. He wanted to go. The Russians said, no, he can't come. I mean, we have been asking, Americans have been asking Putin for a deal from well before the war even started. And then every time Putin did something, we would ask for a deal. And he said, no. I mean, we've been asking for a deal for a decade. And he has flipped us the proverbial bird. I mean, we're talking about a vicious person who murders his enemies. And the only thing that this guy understands is a brick wall that hits him back. I mean, Ronald Reagan not only hit them with a wall, he did a gigantic strategic offensive. That's another podcast that, by the way, is an underappreciated masterstroke of American strategy, how we defeated the Soviet Empire. It was not just a matter of Gorbachev caving into our military spending. It was a very sophisticated plan to bring down the Soviet regime. That story needs to be told, but that offensive was accompanied by a relentless ideological and personal attack on the Soviet leaders, or not leaders, dictators, calling them every sort of name. And of course, they were calling us all sorts of names. And by the time Reagan was done, the Russian people were mobbing him with affection in Leningrad, and he and Gorbachev were doing deals at Reykjavik and thereafter. I mean, politicians, especially people who become heads of their countries by murdering each other, are not worried about you hurting their feelings. They're worried about what you're going to do to them if they don't agree. They're worried about how smart you are as a strategist. I mean, we both know that Donald Trump is no master strategist.
You say we both.
I know he's not.
I wouldn't say that I don't think he's I wouldn't say that I think he's a master strategist. I think that he is good in strategizing in certain ways, in certain key areas.
He's become president of the United States, so that takes a certain amount of strategy.
I think that takes a certain level of strategy.
Yes, it does. But he is not, and I don't actually think that Putin is a grand strategist. He's a very good tactician. He's an intelligence officer.
I think for the record, just to get back on this, I think Trump is good at surrounding himself with good strategists, personally.
I'm not sure. He doesn't build a team, and he runs through the members of his team like the rest of us change socks. But anyway, that's another.
He's a businessman. He's a
Yeah.
businessman.
Well, I don't even think he's a very good businessman. The next bank regulator, I've seen his financials. I know he's not a good businessman. But the point is Putin has an ass. He's cultivated Trump or compromised him. I don't know what he's done, but Trump does whatever he wants, and that's his own kind of strategy or tactics. He's got Trump where he wants him, and Trump has. I mean, I know that Putin has a very good relationship with MBS and Saudi Arabia. They still have that leering smile between them, shaking hands at that G20 summit about how they put it over on the Americans. So, I mean, we're even negotiating on the sovereign territory of a fake ally who loves having put one over on Trump. So, Putin is not interested in a deal. He wants to conquer all of Ukraine, absorb it into a reconstituted Russian empire, and then subvert, and intrude on, and then conquer other adjacent territories, and do what Russia's always done in the past. But it will not make Russia stronger. I mean, it's making it weaker, and that's actually a problem for us. We do not want Russian power to so completely collapse that it cannot defend its territorial integrity against the Chinese.
Right.
But I don't think that Russia will ever be able to summon the energy of its people the way Zelensky has been able to summon the energy of the Ukrainian people to defend Russia's territorial integrity against the Chinese. So long as the Russian people are whip dogs,
especially not right now,
plagued by corruption. Yeah, or in the future. I mean, Russia now has almost 1 million people less than it did before. And the more Russia's territory hollows out of its people, the more vulnerable it becomes to the Chinese.
I'd say propaganda aside, it's got to be, regardless of what you see or what they see or what they seem to think about their country, it's got to be pretty difficult knowing that your friends are dying. And
the Russian rulers are always they're heartless about the way they treat their young. They just throw them into these human wave attacks and like chattel.
And I mean, no Russian is going to come out and say, I mean, well, there are some that are, but not many of them. But I feel like the
they don't
majority
survive long if they do.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I wouldn't be out in the streets being like, well, I disagree 100% with this, and because obviously if they do, then they end up getting, well, in certain situations, get murdered.
Yeah.
But you've got to think that internally they're like, especially the mothers of these individuals have got to be. I mean, well, they're grieving because their child has just died, but B, they've got to be talking behind the scenes and saying what is going on here. Whereas like Ukraine is, to your point, they are all trying to survive and protect their country, so they know there's a reason for it. But if you're in Russia and you're like, well, why are we going to expand into another unless you have truly been manipulated and brainwashed to the point of thinking that expansionism back to the point of the Soviet Union is the goal, which
and some are
is also a large percentage. It's like, there's definitely a percentage of people there. It's like, I don't know what percentage that is, but yeah, you got to think at some point you're like, wow, like what are we really doing?
You remember the submarine, the Kursk?
Yep.
Putin has one press conference a year around New Year's. I don't know if this was during the press conference or it was during the crisis with the Kursk, which Sandy Berger, I don't like Sandy Berger. He asked the Russians if they want help rescuing the Kursk in the most humiliating and demeaning way, making it almost possible for the Russians to say, yes, would like your help. I mean, the best way to help rescue the sailors is would go in and say nothing, plant your ship there and say, we're here to help, and we're not going to say anything in the press. That would be saving the Russians' face. But anyway, we didn't do that. And some mother of one of the sailors on that boat, the Kursk submarine, yelled at Putin, saying, you're letting my son die, and how dare you? Well, 3 members of the FSB came up, surrounded the poor woman, injected a needle into her throat, and carried her off. I mean, that was how he dealt with grieving mothers. I don't think he's worried about saving anyone's face. It is, in fact, the first political lesson that Russia's ever learned under net.
Well, sorry, real quick on that about saving face, just real quick. In order to keep his entire country from revolting, right? Like, don't you think he has to say? I mean, he does have to save face. So,
Yes. And we've been asking for a deal for 10 years. And we know that if he had given, if he had respected the 1994 accord that, he and Nelson signed and promised to observe, and that we offered to do a deal. If he said, I will leave Ukraine alone if you give me Crimea and a few pieces of Eastern Ukraine, we would have taken that deal. In fact, just before the war, Biden went on these video conferences with him for hours, offering some sort of deal. He wouldn't take it. I mean, if Putin came to us now and said, all right, this far, and I'll sign a treaty and we'll leave Ukraine, we would take it. But he's not coming forward and saying that he'll do that. I mean, he's calling us names. He's calling Zelensky a Nazi, and he's doing everything but offering a deal. But, we would take it.
yeah.
I mean, in fact, if he came out and said, this far and no farther, and I'll sign a treaty, it would be virtually impossible for us to say no. The Ukrainians would be upset, but it would be like Vietnam in 1973, in January of 73, when we negotiated over Chew's Head and came to an agreement and told the South Vietnamese government, take it or leave it, you're on your own. And of course, the Ukrainians would want an adequate supply of weapons to defend themselves if he violated the agreement, but I don't think he'll agree to that. And especially since his principal agreement is demand is that Ukraine not be allowed to join NATO. But, we have offered him every kind of deal, and I have never heard him offer any kind of deal that involved these components.
So let's just say in the next month or so, Trump does get a deal done, and they keep Crimea, they keep the portions of Ukraine that they've taken up to this point, and everything else stays intact, and we start to build back, whatever that looks like. Would that not be better than a continuation of the war?
Well, that's what the Czechs thought in 1938, 1939.
Right? But
maybe.
But at least
I don't think Trump would turn that down.
But at least I say at least you can create some level of calm, right? And then figure out how to not restructure, but support Ukraine in some way to help them to continue to build up their. I
don't disagree, but I don't think Putin will.
Okay, so here we go. Let's do this. If Trump's able to make that happen the next month, would that not be one of the most incredible negotiations of all time?
No, because we've been asking for that deal for 10 years.
If he gets it in the next month, then would that not? Then that would be one of the best. I just want to. This my biggest thing is.
All right, say we agreed to that. Say we agreed to that. And we, and Putin has made it very clear what he wants. Well, he said he wants Ukraine wiped off the map. But say we took the deal that you're talking about, which, by the way, he is not talking about. The only author of this deal that you're talking about is not in Moscow. It's totally, we're negotiating with ourselves here. That should be made very clear. All right, but they
were with Russian. Marco Rubio was with Russian diplomats yesterday.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean. Have you seen if the parts of this agreement are so easy to discuss, why haven't they agreed to them?
Because they're not easy.
He's been in
super
Saudi
complex.
Arabia. Huh?
It's because it's not easy. It's super complex.
Well, all right. So the idea of creating a peace in one day by Trump was ridiculous because it is complex. Now, say we agreed to everything that you just said. I don't believe for a minute that Putin would stick to that agreement, but say we tried it anyway. And say we said, all right, now that we've agreed to this, we have to supply the Ukrainian army to keep you honest. Do you think Putin would agree to that? And if, I mean, why does Ukraine want to be part of NATO anyway? So that Putin can't do what he's been doing for 10 years. I mean, if that's all that Putin wants is Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, then he should be willing to accept Ukraine in NATO. But he doesn't want to. Why doesn't he want to? What is it about Ukraine being protected by Article 5 in NATO?
Well, because you refer to NATO as a defensive force, whereas he perceives it as an offensive force.
Offensive in what way? I'm
just saying that's the way that he portrays it as an offensive organization. So regardless of if it is or isn't,
political threat.
Correct. But
not a military threat.
But you and I both know that if that was the same situation in Canada or Mexico, America would be just as furious.
I don't think neither we nor the Canadians nor the Mexicans have invaded, leveled entire cities, stolen their children, indoctrinated them to hate their own
parents. If Russia was
the
majority leader of an organization that happened to be that Mexico or Canada happened to be joining, don't you think we'd be a little pissed off? This is devil's advocate.
I'm confident that if the Russians actually did try to do that in Central America in the 1980s, and we supplied local, militias to fight them.
We fought back.
Yep. Yeah, and every time we have faced an enemy like this, we have fought for reasons that people could understand. We were in a position after World War II and after the wall fell to invade Russia. Did we? No. I mean, you keep creating these scenarios that presuppose the Russians being in mortal danger of the West invading their country, plundering them, and doing all these terrible things. When we both know that NATO is a defensive alliance, and we have never done these things, and we could have done them, but there are lots of chances to do them, but we didn't do them.
I mean, we've been in hybrid warfare with Russia for a very long time.
They have been waging hybrid warfare against us, not the reverse. He doesn't like the fact that people in NATO countries can call him names.
So let's just be intellectually honest here. We've got to be. We've been waging war on each other for a very long time. You say that we have not been waging war on them. It's just all single sided. That's just not true. It's been a constant battle between our countries.
What terrible thing did we do to Russia?
Hybrid warfare comes in many different forms. So
we didn't invent the hybrid war. That was Gennady Gerasimov invented the hybrid.
What you're saying is that we've never put spies in Russia. We've never.
Oh, please, that argument.
Oh well,
we put spies in Russia.
That's what I'm saying, though. Of course we have spies,
and we're supposed to feel guilty about that.
Of course we've sabotaged their nuclear arsenal. Probably. Of course we've probably sabotaged. I'm just saying,
what have we done to threaten the territorial integrity, the political independence, the physical danger to the Russian people ever? What have we done?
I just think there's a lot of general comments I can make to that, and a lot of general statements.
Yeah, but whataboutism does not. What have we done to threaten the Russian people? And
this is not a pro-Russia argument. This is just a just being very honest with ourselves about the fact that we have sabotaged Russia just like Russia has sabotaged us for decades. I mean, the Cold War is a prime example of that. We've been at war with them for a while.
We've never been at war with the Russians.
Okay.
In
a hybrid warfare sense, we have been at war with the Russians for a while.
The Russians waged the communist regime the Tsarist regime waged territorial aggressive wars for 300 years.
Yep.
The communist regime waged an ideological war of spies, terrorism, ideological warfare. I actually I have a passage from one of George Kennan's great books, that talks about the one-sided onslaught against the West that was never equaled by any of our actions. They were the aggressors. They were the ones who waged the onslaught against every aspect of Western society, against democracy, against our economic system, denounced us in every possible way. And those who tried to do both sidesism, superimpose a moral equivalency between their assault on the West, the communist assault on the West, and our efforts to resist it, that is disingenuous in the extreme. We did not start the assault. The communist system did. And it was not a struggle between the Democrats and the Republicans. The communist system was as satanic and evil as the Nazi system. And it is responsible for hundreds of millions of murders.
Yep.
And the idea that we should feel guilty about defending ourselves against that monstrous satanic system is ridiculous. And Putin, who, by the way, has been rehabilitating Stalin, and Dzerzhinsky, who is the founder of the Cheka, the precursor to the KGB and the FSB, as if the victims of the communist regime were not innocents, as if we were somehow at fault for resisting it's just ridiculous. Nor do I feel guilty about President Reagan's comprehensive strategic counteroffense against the Russians, which, by the way, was in many ways authored by President Nixon to bring down the Soviet regime.
Right.
The world is a better place because the Soviet communist regime is done. The communist ideology is in the ash heap of history. And instead of having 70,000 nuclear warheads, and we have 1,550 on each side, that is an astounding thing, that we are all safer because of it. And as soon as that evil regime was destroyed and overthrown, all of the diplomatic initiatives and the agreements that we wanted to make peace in the world magically became very possible because we were not dealing with a predatory evil regime.
Do you actually believe that the 1550 number is true? Do you actually agree with that? Do you think that's the case? The 1550 nukes?
Well, that's how many launchers we have. We have and warheads, but we do have about another 1,500 warheads in our nuclear facility, which I hope is not taken apart along with the Department of Energy the way everything else is being taken apart.
Well, apparently they were fired and then rehired.
Nukes flying around because someone doesn't feel like paying for them.
Yeah. For the record, that was not the last couple of comments were not me defending. It was more so just trying to be honest about the situation and maybe trying to think through why he's trying to do the things he's doing or what his plans might be for the future.
He is trying to do this because we harbor his critics. Democracy and Article 5 protect people who call him names and expose him for what he is.
So what you're saying is he is an emotional individual.
Pardon me?
So he is an emotional individual.
Well, I suppose. I mean, he wants to kill people, but he doesn't want to be killed.
Isn't that a lot of leaders? Isn't that a lot of
Yes,
politicians?
they are. Yes, they are. I mean,
some just might sound nicer on the outside, but don't they all want to be able to kill people and not be killed themselves?
But his behavior is a lot more vicious and predatory than ours has been.
Well, he just started a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, now millions of people. So
a million
not great.
of his own people.
Yeah,
that's not even
great.
Counting all the people he's killed in Ukraine.
Not great.
I mean, the guy does not deserve sympathy.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
The Soviet regime that he's rehabilitating and saying wasn't such a bad does not deserve any consideration as a moral entity. It was evil.
John,
I'm
on
glad
the
we got rid of it.
because we both know that we both know where we stand on that front. What else with Eurasia do we think people need to know about?
Oh, well, you are right about that. China is using a lot of these arguments too. I mean, ask any foreign Chinese student, matriculating here, uh, what he thinks about America. And you will find out that the Chinese have rewritten their textbooks to educate their young people to hate us because they are preparing their young for the war of conquest or their strategy for global domination. And ask a Chinese student about the history that they think they know about America. Ask them if they know that America was on their side in World War II against the Japanese. The Chinese foreign students will say, oh, no, you were against us. Wrong. We were on China's side, and we sent billions of dollars to help them fight the Japanese. Ask them who the presidents were who recognized China as a sovereign equal and did not impose unequal treaties during the century of humiliation that they talk about. And they will say, oh, no, you imposed unequal treaties on us. Wrong. We were the only major country that did not demand and get territorial concessions from China the way the French and the Germans and the Russians and the British did, and the Austrians too. Indeed, we, with our open door policy, specifically said we don't want any territorial concessions from China. And when the Boxer Rebellion happened, and the Chinese were forced to pay an indemnity for murdering all sorts of Western diplomats, we did not use that money to create an empire in China. We create something called the Boxer Rebellion Scholarship, which is given to Chinese Americans to be great scholars. And I know one of the Boxer Rebellion scholars. His name is Nelson Kiang. He's an American citizen, but he's the leader of the pro-mainland China community in the Boston area. He's one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. But even he said to me that all countries, that China is central, it's the Middle Kingdom, and all other countries will be tributary countries to China. And I said, well, you could see why other countries in the United States will resist that idea. And he said, that's because you're a brainwashed American. I said, brainwashed or not, we will resist a Chinese domination of the world.
Maybe it's a brainwashing that'll make us resist.
Well, maybe that will work. And the Chinese students will say that the first president who recognized China on equal terms was President John Tyler, who was an unremarkable American president. Anyway, the Chinese will say, oh, no, he imposed an unequal treaty on China. No, he didn't. But then they say the most evil American president who tried to impose a diplomatic agreement with a view to subjugating China, they said was Abraham Lincoln. And I said, no. First of all, Abraham Lincoln had other things on his mind, and conquering China was not one of them. And he did not impose an unequal treaty on China. They insist that he did. And then they complain that we interfere in their sphere of influence by intruding ourselves in their negotiations with their neighbors. Specifically, China has made extravagant territorial demands on every one of its 14 contiguous neighbors, on additional 17 countries in the East, South China Seas, and elsewhere with its 9-dash line in the Western Pacific. And they say that they bitterly resent the fact that whenever the Chinese foreign ministry has quote unquote negotiating sessions with their neighbors. Whether it's not just Taiwan, I'm talking about Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Russia, Korea, all of them. They resent the fact that these countries always invite an American military attaché or an American Foreign Service officer to attend these sessions with them. And they say, we should be able to negotiate with these countries without your interference. And I said, why do you think those American diplomats or military attachés why do these countries invite the Americans to sit in on these meetings? Because you want to interfere. I said, no, because these countries want the American backing so you can't bully them into surrendering their territory to you. Well, then they say, well, that's because it's our territory in the first place. I said, no, it isn't. And in any case, we're not letting you conquer these countries. Well, that's interference in our sphere of the world. I said, well, yes, it is. Deal with it. And so they find it irritating that I don't feel particularly guilty about confronting the Chinese, or the fact that these countries invite American diplomats and military attachés to these meetings. And their so-called win-win solutions, agreements with our industrialists, are basically forced technology transfers and plundering of our technology. That which they don't steal, they force in one-sided technology transfer agreements. And we have effectively fed a tiger that is going to eat us or attack us to indulge the greed of American and Fortune 500 companies and private equity firms that have made a fortune exploiting Chinese labor and transferring technology to China that was not theirs to transfer. It was not, these companies are great American companies, IBM, General Motors, were built up by generations of Americans. And just because these CEOs are connive their way to the top does not mean that it is their technology to transfer it to the Chinese, or their jobs, or their execution skills, or their industry to transfer to China. Most of the technology that American industry runs on was funded by the federal government. And the fact that these companies pay starving PhD students a pittance for the technology they invent, and then they offshore it to our enemies and call it their own, which it isn't. And that the Chinese are using this technology not only to eat our lunch, but to use that technology in dual use systems, and namely weapons that are being used against us. Look at any Chinese warplane or drone, and they are carbon copies of ours because they're using our technology. And when I've talked about this hemorrhage of American technology, these American CEOs have told me, I'm not letting anyone tell me what I can do with my technology. I say, it's not your technology. The American people funded it. And they said, well, there's nothing you can do about it. I said, well, there is. The British, when they built up their woolens and later their textile cotton industries, said that any businessman in Britain who took the money from the crown and then offshored their industry, the British crown would seize the money, seize their companies, seize their assets on the London Stock Exchange, and seize their passport. If you take the federal government's money, the people's money, then you should lose your passport, your American citizenship, and all your money, because you're thieving from the American people. And I would create a system of intellectual property covenants forbidding any American company that uses publicly funded technology from offshoring that technology. And I would not stop President Biden's industrial policy or the Chips and Science Act or any of these acts. I would add to them and restore our execution skills in our industry, not only to give the American people better and more broadly based prosperity, because manufacturing always pays better. It supports a variety of different occupations. But also you cannot wage a war unless you have a very powerful defense industrial base, and that means manufacturing. But a lot of the boom in manufacturing since we started these Chips and Science Acts and other bills have been stalled because even though the federal government is subsidizing these and is bringing industry back here, these companies can't find Americans capable of doing of carrying out, using the execution skills required to rebuild American high-tech manufacturing.
Which is why the vast majority of it's going to be automated with robots anyways.
Well, so, yeah, but even it takes a highly skilled person to use these robots.
Certain robots, yeah, but it's I mean, we're obviously it's headed there anyways, but it's going to get to the point where we talk about American prosperity and jobs and all these things. I think it's a great talking point from like 3 decades ago, personally, but it's
the lights out factory. You mean?
Sorry,
the lights out factory.
Yes,
when the robots. Well, I've consulted
we're getting there rapidly.
Company. Yeah, I've consulted with a robotics company, and there's still lots of things that the American people can do. In fact, there is so much to do in this country, rebuilding our infrastructure, rebuilding our defense industrial base, rebuilding everything, which we've allowed to atrophy and hollow out with all this offshoring and outsourcing, that there are plenty of jobs for everyone, even with robotics. But unless we restore the skill sets of the American people, we won't be able to do any of it. And when we have a war with China over Taiwan, or a war with China over their attempt to seize Siberia, we will have what's called our Suez moment, when we will run out rapidly of our weapon supplies, not because we gave them to Ukraine, but because we don't know how to build anything anymore. And because the Chinese have been studying warfare, have been building up their military at a very rapid pace, while we have been living off of the Reagan buildup for 40 years. And this is very dangerous. Fortunately, the Ukraine war has exposed these gaps, but we're not moving fast enough to rebuild them. In fact, we're deconstructing the government that we need to mobilize the country's war production and our manufacturing. And we're not going to do that with no money either. I mean, we've destroyed our revenue base by tax cuts. We've exported our tax base to foreign countries, particularly China. And as a consequence, we're running up chronic deficits because the tax revenue that comes from the industry, we've sent it offshore, so we can't tax it. No tariffs cannot recover that revenue base. Revenues come from rebuilding domestic demand and domestic productivity.
So, John, we obviously have a lot to do domestically.
Do we ever?
So, in wrapping up Eurasia, not even wrapping up, but just
we're just starting. But
yeah. So, in just starting Eurasia,
that we don't let if we have one strategic objective that's more important than any other, it's not let any one continental power dominate that landmass.
Right.
And we're not going to be able to succeed in preventing that unless we rebuild our defense industrial base, our manufacturing, our execution skills, and our government and our industrial policy. Because our government is now smaller than it was before World War II. And like our manufacturing, can't do anything anymore. I mean, you might have a law saying we're going to build housing, but if you don't fund it, the law becomes meaningless. I mean, yeah, someone says, John, you ought to you need a vacation. You ought to go to the West Indies for a vacation. All right, where's the money? Oh, I'm just giving you the advice. I'm not giving you the money to go there. Well, then that's useless advice. That's basically talking about the need to bring industry back without funding it, without rebuilding people's execution skills, without having a strategy. is useless. And that's where we are. And the Chinese are just waiting, biding their time, letting us pretend that we're number one. It's really pathetic to see people demonstrating after ball games. We're number one. Or even after bin Laden's death, which I wasn't exactly sad about, people yelling, we're number one. Well, actually, we've allowed our strength, the sinews of our power, to atrophy. And the only reason we haven't been confronted is because the Chinese are we're doing a good job hollowing out our power on our own. They don't need to get on our way. By encouraging Russia to invade Ukraine, we are finding out how hollowed out our power is, and we should make the most of that warning. But to talk about Eurasia, that is a massive subject. We can't do it in this podcast because just talking about the different parts of Eurasia are only able to operate on themselves without being subjugated by their bigger neighbors or by the Chinese.
Well, let's do this.
America vetoes invasions before they can start.
Yeah,
Once American credibility is gone, Eurasia will dissolve into one mess of wars, torture chambers, and it will be like Yugoslavia writ large. And that's Russia's weakness is probably as big a danger to as its victory in Ukraine.
Let's do this. Let's stop this one here.
Okay.
And we will plan on doing another one
Okay.
to keep this conversation going.
Okay.
And we'll also hopefully get some feedback in the meantime from folks to see which parts they're most interested in learning about. And we'll be able to add that into the next episode as well.
That sounds great. Well, thanks for having me on, and I hope people learn some stuff that they didn't know before.
Absolutely. Thank you again, John. Thanks again for your time.
My pleasure.